Hello everyone and welcome to this week's special video where we're going to be having a look back at the 2 years of Equilinox development, starting at the very beginning and going up to the point where we're at now. In this video I'm going to show you how the game has progressed from month to month, and I'll also talk a little bit about some of the decisions that I made along the way, how I feel about those decisions now, and things that I do differently next time. So the story starts way back in September of 2015, and I'm not really sure how many of you were already following me back then, but if you were, you'll remember that I was previously working on a different game, and I had just done a Kickstarter campaign for that game, which was unfortunately unsuccessful. So at the time I was looking to find a job, and I also wanted to start a much simpler project that I could work on at the same time as having the job. And I think I said in one of my videos at the time that this new smaller game was just going to take a few months to complete. That was over 2 years ago, so obviously estimating how long things are going to take is not one of my strengths. I can't quite remember where the idea for Equilinox came from, but I do remember that one day on the train to Wolfsburg I was writing down a lot of plans for the game, a lot of features that I wanted to have in the game, and I managed to find those notes. You can see them here, and I was just looking through these the other day, and it turns out that the game did actually end up quite similar to how I planned it on that very first day. Before I started actually programming Equilinox, I needed to decide on the art style that I was going to use, and I'd been considering the low poly art style for quite a while, so one day I decided to try it out in Blender and create a low poly scene, and you can actually see that low poly scene here. This is a scene that I created way back before I'd even started Equilinox, and a lot of these models actually ended up being the first models in the game, and I think 2 or 3 of them are even still in the game now. So obviously I was happy enough with this low poly scene, and I decided to get started with actually programming the game. So pretty quickly I got started with creating the engine for Equilinox, and I started off by generating the terrain. I generated random terrain, and I also added some colour changing abilities to it so that I could later implement biomes. And you can see that here, this is the very first version of Equilinox that I could find on my computer with just the terrain and its colour changing abilities. I then moved on to creating a batch rendering system for objects, which took quite a while, but eventually I got that all working, and I started implementing the ability to place objects, and for those objects to spread biomes on the terrain. And around this time I made the first devlog video about Equilinox, which you can of course still check out on my channel. Going into October of 2015, I continued working on the engine for Equilinox, adding new features such as the low poly water, which I was extremely proud of at the time. I think this was pretty much the first time that I'd ever kind of come up with my own graphical feature and worked it out myself, rather than just learning it from a tutorial online. This was something that I sat down, worked through, and implemented myself, and for me that was quite a big milestone in my learning of OpenGL. I also then implemented text, a simple main menu for Equilinox, and also shadows into the engine. In November I worked on a post-processing pipeline for Equilinox and added a couple of effects like the bloom effect and the depth of field effect, which again were things that I hadn't worked on before, so this was the first time that I was learning about them. I also implemented a very simple audio system into Equilinox, and I added the first growing tree. So this was the first plant in the game that had multiple model stages and actually grew over time. So it was the first species in the game that had some sort of actual life cycle. And to finish off 2015, I added support for particle effects into the engine and also made a few Christmassy models. Starting off in 2016, I made it possible for entities to have customizable colours. So even though I was just using the same tree models, I could make the leaves of the trees different colours, and I could make the wool of the sheep different colours. And at the same time I started work on an extremely simple basic breeding system for the sheep, where they basically just duplicated every few seconds, but when they did duplicate they passed on their colour with a slight variation. And because of this I remember having quite a lot of fun at the time just trying to simulate evolution, because by simulating a predator that couldn't see the colour red very well, by just making sheep less likely to die the more red they are, the whole population of sheep would slowly over time evolve to be red. In February, things were really starting to take shape as I implemented the UI system and added the very basic toolbar into the game. I also made it possible to select objects by implementing a colour picking system, and when you clicked on an entity it would bring up the entity info GUI, which showed some simple stats about the entity. The concept of diversity points, which is like the in-game currency, was also added to the game back then, and I started thinking about the shops, as you can see here. Finally, it was also possible to now pick up entities and move them around in the world by right-clicking on them, and the concept of biomes was also added into the game at that time, and you can see the biome picker tool here, which tells you how much of each biome there is at any given point on the terrain. Moving into spring of 2016, the game really started expanding, in some cases literally, as I increased the world size about 4 times, and with that I had to do quite a lot of optimization to make sure that the game could still run well. The in-game shop also opened for business in March, looking very different from how it does now, but this finally allowed you to easily select which object you wanted to place, plus you now had to purchase the species with your diversity points. Most importantly that month, I started implementing the life cycles for all the different species in the game, so I gave them all multiple model stages so that they could all grow over time, and I added the breeding system so that they could all reproduce and plants could spread over an area, and then of course after a while each plant or animal would die. I also added the first couple of new species into the game, which was the birch tree and this rather strange looking rat creature. The birch tree is actually still in the game today. The weird rat sadly is not. In April I started making some very good progress redoing the shop to pretty much how it looks now. I also implemented locked items in the shop, the inventory was added so that you didn't have to buy items one by one. I also implemented the species information panel, and the design for this has changed so many times over the last 2 years, as you'll see in this video. But the idea of this panel was to give general information about a given species. As well as that, I also worked on the evolution trees, which allow you to evolve a species and unlock new species, and I remember making the UI for this took me ages. I had a lot of problems with it, but I did eventually get it working, as you can see here in the species information panel. And in order to unlock a new species, you had to meet certain breeding requirements, which were usually getting a trait to a certain level, and in order to change the traits of an animal or plant you had to selectively breed them. And to make it easier to selectively breed them, I also added this button here. So while I've been preparing this video, I've been looking back through the release notes that I made each month when I released the game on Patreon, and the release notes for May say that there are only going to be a few more of these releases before the final release, and that was 1.5 years ago, so I was still obviously not getting any better at estimating how long things would take. I did however get quite a lot done that month with the addition of the task system, which allows you to complete tasks in order to get rewards, and the rewards could either be diversity points or it could unlock a new species. I also added a notification system, so when you breed a new animal or plant or a task gets finished you get notified about it, and there were also a couple of little graphical changes such as the addition of the skybox and the sun with the lens flare effect. It also looks like I was just starting to implement the environmental requirement system at that point, but I didn't fully implement that until June, where I also created a health system for the plants and the animals. So you can see now in the entity pop-up GUI that each animal and plant has a health bar and also an environmental satisfaction bar showing how happy it is with its environment, and you could mouse over these to get more information. The environmental preferences of each species were then also displayed in the species information panel, which as you can see received its first of many makeovers. There was also a new tab added to the entity pop-up GUI to separate the traits from the current stats of an animal or plant, and this also allowed you to alter the traits in return for DP, making it possible to basically genetically modify the plants and animals to have crazy traits, such as these extremely high bouncing sheep. And this made the whole evolving new species system a little bit easier. I also redid the main menu a bit, but that also didn't last very long. That got redone again a couple of months later. And you'll find that redoing things is a bit of a recurring theme in this video. There were quite a few instances where I implemented something and then re-implemented it multiple times later. But I think that's mainly because I'm learning and improving as I go. So although I would implement something as best as I could at the time, a few months later I'd be more experienced, I'd have a better knowledge about stuff, and I'd look back at those things that I did previously and I'd realise that I could do better now. And obviously I wanted to redo them. So I don't necessarily think that the constant redoing is a bad thing. unless of course it's just due to bad planning. It obviously takes time to redo stuff, but I think that's just how it goes when you're learning and trying to improve. You're not always going to get everything right first time. Next up, I implemented another graphical effect for the plants and the trees, which was to make them look like they're moving in the wind. I also added some spawning restrictions to make sure that trees didn't grow into each other. There was also a new custom cursor for when you're placing items into the world, and the biomes got a bit of an upgrade with some biome particle effects and sound effects. And as I mentioned, the main menu also got changed again. In August, I then decided that I had pretty much added all of the basic game mechanics into the game, and that it was about time to start concentrating on adding the content into the game, adding all the species and the behaviours. So before I started this, I wanted to start with a completely clean slate, so I removed everything from the game, all the species and the tasks, and I wanted to go through all the species and add them into the game one by one. So I started off with just the grass and the sheep, and while I did that, I implemented some improved behaviours for the sheep, such as a hunger system, which meant that animals now had to eat to stay alive, and therefore you had to make sure that food was available in the nearby area. There were also some changes made to the AI system so that I could implement some more interesting AIs, and I used this for the young sheep to make them follow their parents. On top of that, there were also a couple of UI changes that month, so I made it possible to edit the name of sheep, I added the commands tab into the entity pop-up GUI, and I also made it possible to edit the colour trait of a species. And once again, I also redid the main menu, and of course the species information panel. In the following months, I was mostly working on adding new species into Equilinox, and as I went, I was also improving the entity system. So for example, in September, I added a couple of new trees and a bush, and I made it possible for trees and bushes to produce fruit, like the fruit bush, and I also added in death animations for plants and animals. In October, a few more species were added, like the wheat, the chickens, the fern, and some new flowers. And I also completely redid the task UI so that in the task panel it would show overviews of the tasks, and then you could click on one of those overviews and it would bring up the full information about that task on the panel on the right here, and that allowed me to provide a bit more information and description about the various tasks. Then in November, something quite important happened.